We have accustomed ourselves to communicating with one another through the impersonal nature of our technology. We seemingly have forgotten how to interact with one another in the flesh and seem to prefer the ease and convenience of the non-incarnate interaction of social media, staring at their phones, even when they are in the company of others. Turkle notes that, quote, digital connections may offer the illusion of companionship without the demands of friendship. Our network life allows us to hide from each other, even as we are tethered to each other. We'd rather text than talk, end quote. What thus becomes of the marketplace, of religious institutions, of schools, of civic organizations in such a digitized milieu? Institutions which, for millennia, traditionally have been sustained by the participatory incarnational relationships. What begins to happen to the culture when people are no longer present with one another? We become a fragmentary reflection of the nothingness of the universe itself. Our bodies no longer matter because in the end they are just matter and some energy, but mostly empty space, according to current theories in physics, originating from nothing, coming together for no apparent reason or purpose, rapidly, entropically headed toward the mechanistic eschaton of hypermodern digitopia, the off switch. Apple Computer's late founder Steve Jobs didn't like the off switch at all. It reminded him of death. Walter Isaacson, his biographer, concluded his 571-page exploration of Jobs' extraordinary life with this moving reflection. Quote, one sunny afternoon, when he wasn't feeling well, Jobs sat in the garden behind his house and reflected on death. He talked about his experiences in India almost 4 decades earlier, his study of Buddhism, and his views on reincarnation and spiritual transcendence. I'm about 50-50 on believing in God, he said. For most of my life, I felt that there must be more to our existence than meets the eye. He admitted that as he faced death, he might be overestimating the odds out of a desire to believe in an afterlife. I like to think that something survives after you die, he said. It's strange to think that you accumulate all this experience and maybe a little wisdom, and it just goes away. So I really want to believe that something survives, that maybe your consciousness endures. He fell silent for a very long time. But on the other hand, perhaps it's like an on-off switch, he said. Click, and you're gone. Then he paused again and smiled slightly. Maybe that's why I never liked to put on-off switches on Apple devices. Steve Jobs died shortly thereafter on October 5th, 2011. Social media, in short, seems to be shutting us off from one another. We willingly have reduced ourselves to avatars and icons. But is there more to life than communicating with one another through social media? In the early 1950s, C.S. Lewis wrote of the modernistic tendency of reductionism of the universe, which I believe also underlies the spirit of social media. Lewis noted that in our scientific attempts at atomizing the cosmos and our creaturely existence, quote, we arrive at a result uncommonly like zero. While we were reducing the world to almost nothing, we deceived ourselves with the fancy that all the lost qualities were being kept safe, if in a somewhat humbled condition, as things in our own mind. Apparently we had no mind of the sort required. The subject is as empty as the object. Almost nobody has been making linguistic mistakes about almost nothing. By and large, this is the only thing that has ever happened, end quote. In the modern world, we came from nothing and will soon return to nothing. But what of Steve Jobs' hesitancy regarding the on-off switch? Is there something beyond this life, something more than what modernity can explain? As a Christian, of course, I think there is, but for the larger secular culture, especially in the realm of social media, such an important question seems to have been emptied of its efficacy, having been reduced to nothing more than a matter of personal opinion, expressed with great zeal and passion. Scientifically speaking, though, such questions are further reduced by the atomistic reductionism of our human experience to mere neurochemical reactions in the brain. In Lewis's work, The Abolition of Man, he says it is impossible to keep doing this sort of emptying, for we, quote, cannot go on explaining away forever. You will find that you have explained explanation itself away. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent because the street or the garden beyond it is opaque. How if you saw through the garden, too? It is no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see." End quote. And with the advent of information and communications technologies, many of which Jobs himself helped create, human beings have, in some sense, truly disappeared. With the interposition of our computer screens and cell phones, we are losing the ability to have meaningful face-to-face conversations about anything. Our faces have been relegated to Facebook or Twitter, and our bodies have become dead weight when conversing about weighty issues. Being incarnate with one another has become a burden for us hypermoderns. We have thus been emptied not only of our incarnational existence in social media, but our consciousness has also been emptied by current scientific explanations. Our human experiences as thinking, feeling, rational beings have been reduced to mere brain states which produce them. Our immaterial self has become as non-existent as our incarnate selves. How then can we even apprehend the universe at all, given this state of affairs? All our descriptions of ourselves and the cosmos are nothing more than the carbon-based effluvium that will eventually turn into the nothing from which it came. Lewis says, quote, "What we thought we were loving when we loved a woman or a friend was not even a phantom like the phantom sail which starving sailors think they see on the horizon." End quote. As it turns out, love is less than phantasmal. It is nothing but mere, quote, sophism disguised as language, end quote. And even language itself has become anemic and attenuated. Neil Gabler notes that in our day and age of social media, quote, "the seamless, informal, immediate, personal, simple, minimal, and short communication is not one that is likely to convey, let alone work out ideas, great or not. Facebook, Twitter, and just about every other social networking site pare everything down to noun and verb and not much more. The sites and the information on them billboard our personal blathering, the effluvium of our lives, and they wind up not expanding the world but shrinking it to our own dimensions. You could call this a metaphor for modern life, increasingly narcissistic and trivial, except that the sites and the posts are modern life for hundreds of millions of people." End quote. In short, the reduction of the universe and ourselves has also reduced our language, our love, and the most meaningful aspects of our lives to nothing as well. Everything becomes a transparent illusion of matter and energy. As neurologist and atheist Sam Harris claims, quote, "For me, an illusion is a subjective experience that is not what it seems. Illusions are experiences in the mind, but they are not out there in nature. Rather, they are events generated by the brain. Most of us have an experience of a self. I certainly have one. And I do not doubt that others do as well, an autonomous individual with a coherent identity and sense of free will. But that experience is an illusion. It does not exist independently of the person having the experience, and it is certainly not what it seems. That's not to say that the illusion is pointless. Experiencing self-illusion may have tangible functional benefits in the way we think and act, but that does not mean that it exists as an entity." End quote. Long before the advent of communications technologies, however, and long before the telescope, King David looked to the heavens and proclaimed that they declare the glory of God. When he contemplated the moon and the stars, the works of God's fingers, he wondered aloud, quote, "What is man, that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man, that you care for him?" End quote. In the classical Christian tradition, the heavens serve to remind man of God's glory and of God's special care of us as bearers of his image. The starry host reveals God's general revelation to man. Through the heavens, we recognize God's majesty, his wisdom, power, creativity, and magnanimity, his invisible attributes, as the Apostle Paul says in the first chapter of Romans. On today's special episode of Good Heavens, I welcome our first ever atheist guest, Chris Bielfus, who I met at a monthly atheist and Christian book club gathering in Arlington. Chris grew up in a Christian home and attended a small Christian college, but slowly began to question his beliefs and his faith in his mid-20s. During one of the recent book club gatherings, Chris shared with me he had been listening to the Good Heavens podcast, and I thought it might be worthwhile to invite him on as a guest to share his perspectives as an atheist on David's cosmic reflections in the Psalms. Both Chris and I agreed that such conversations are worth having in person, face to face. Though we certainly have our differences about the nature of the cosmos, we are nonetheless committed to incarnate dialogue. So come along on this episode of Good Heavens and meet Chris and hear his story. Both Chris and I hope this episode will encourage you to reflect, as David did, on the heavens, and have much-needed incarnate conversations with others with whom you might disagree. Well, good morning, Chris Bielfus. You are our first atheist guest on the Good Heavens podcast. Thank you for coming. How are you this morning?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
No pressure at all, but...
why don't you tell everybody how you met, how we met, and your experience with Good Heavens, and why you left the faith. Why don't you take some time to go ahead and tell our listeners about that?
Let's see. Well, we first met we have a local group called the Atheist Christian Book Club, which is a organization where atheists and Christians, they get together, and once every month we have a meeting and we read books alternating between Christian literature and atheist literature, and then we get together and have civil discussions about stuff like that.
Yeah, it's great.
It's a very rare thing nowadays, and we found that we had kind of common interests in astronomy and the cosmos and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, so when I first met you, one of the first things you said to me was that you listened to Good Heavens, or this is after we met, and then you were listening to Good Heavens. I was like, wow, I didn't know we had a skeptic listener. That's really cool. So yeah, I think the book club is really a fantastic thing. It's getting more and more people. Last month we had, or earlier this month, we barely had enough people to fit into James's office, didn't we?
Yeah, they're having to turn people away, but thankfully it's on Facebook. If you look it up online, you'll see where you can view our meetings on Facebook Live. If you're not in Texas or can't make it to a meeting, we'll give that our plug there. It's definitely worth a view, in our opinion.
And there will be I'll put a link. We'll give you a link to the Facebook page that you can watch it if you're not in Texas. So that's great. So that's how we met. And as Chris said, it's a very ecumenical. It's a very everything that you wouldn't expect. It's a good group of people that we have a lot of disagreement, but we seem to be able to enjoy each other's company and get along quite well. It's a lot of fun. So fill us in on your testimony, how you became a Christian, how you walked away from Christianity, and the reasons for and against and all that stuff.
I don't know, would it be an anti-testimony if I'm telling
deconversion
how I left
experience?
The faith? Yeah. Well, I mean, I grew up suburban, non-denominational Protestant church. I was also really into Christian apologetics for a long time in high school and college, but I only ever read the Christian side of things. So I was kind of reinforcing what I had already believed and was raised to believe. But anyone who's been in the church a while, they probably have doubts that pop up into your head every now and again. And if they come up one at a time, then they're easy enough to kind of dismiss or come up with a line you can give yourself out of hand when those thoughts come up. But it got to the point where I realized if I was ever going to have a hope of really reaching other people as an evangelist, as a witness, then I would need to, as Peter said, I would need to have a ready defense for these kind of questions. Because if I have these thoughts, then of course non-believers are going to have these thoughts also, and I should be willing to answer them.
Yeah.
So in line with that, I started reading some non-Christian biblical scholarship and things like that. And one by one, these questions popped up, and I realized that the non-Christian answers made more sense to me than the Christian apologetics that I had been reading.
Okay.
Questions about, is the Bible the literal inerrant word of God, or is creationism the real science behind a origin of life, and things like that. And it just got to the point where I could not, in good conscience, keep going with the faith anymore. It just that just kind of, I would have to force myself to profess a belief in something that I really couldn't say I believed anymore.
Yeah. So you were you raised in a Christian home?
Yes.
Okay. So you had, if you don't mind me asking, what denomination?
Some sort of extenuating circumstance like that, then I'm an example of a place where that's just not true.
Yeah.
It was
because not all atheists are angry at the church per se. That's a kind of a stereotype that you must hate God, or you must have some sort of bad experience, or someone wronged you, or something like that. It's not your case at all.
Yeah, I couldn't interact with Christians the way I do on a regular basis if I was super angry at the church as an institution.
Right. So it's like any institution, right? There are people that are doing well, and there are people that are giving it a bad name.
Yeah, exactly. We want to sort through that stuff.
Right. Just as there are in any walk of life, whether it's atheism or religion or mathematics or science or scholasticism, there's always a bad bunch that ruins it for everybody else. But so that's not your background. You just had some questions about that. And so how long was that process? How would you say?
Let's see, I haven't been to church in probably 5 years at this point. The questioning period was maybe a couple of years before that. And
how old were you when this was going on?
This would be like I was 25, 26, and I'm in my mid-30s now. So, I definitely put in my time with the church.
Sure. Now, do you have college? Did you go through this?
Yeah, I went to a Christian college.
Okay.
I had my Bible education along with my vocational education, and once again, that was not a bad experience. I think it would be interesting to go back now as an atheist and talk to some of my professors at this point, or my classmates.
So did the doubts start to, were you kind of shoving the doubts aside while you were in college, or did you not have them until after college, or?
Well, it's really easy when you're in a Christian school like that. It was a really small school and a small community. I think the town we were in literally has the most churches per capita in the United States or something like that, or at least they claim to, who knows. So it was very easy to stay within that Christian bubble, the classic analogy, and find all the reinforcement you wanted for your beliefs. So that was part of the period where I might have a doubt come up, and then I'd be able to push it away and in favor of what I was already going with.
Okay, so I have to ask you, because this always comes up. I'm sure you've encountered believers that have said, well, Chris, you really never were a Christian to begin with. How would you respond to that?
I would put my faith in terms of sincerity along the same level of any Christian who could be. I was out doing door-to-door ministry. Like I said, I was interested in apologetics and having that kind of defense. And if I couldn't have known that I was a fake Christian, quote unquote, at that time, they can't say that they're not fake Christians now and that they'll deconvert 10 years from now.
So you would disavow anybody saying, really knowing that you never were saved.
Yeah, I just don't know how you tell the difference between, you're in a pew with 10 people. How many of them are fake Christians?
It gets into a very difficult way to assess. I think of the parable of the seeds. You're familiar with that, right? Where Jesus, some seeds fall on the wayside, the birds snatch them up. Some seeds sprout but don't have root. Some take root and are choked out by the weeds, and then some endure. So, as I say, I have no idea whether or not people to the right and the left of me in the pew are going to endure to the end, or if they're going to endure for a short time. We meet people in a very small period of their lives. We just don't know what's going on. As Jesus says, not everybody that says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, in Matthew 7. It's always the case for self-examination. And so I think at the very least, you went through a period of self-examination and found that at the present that you were unsatisfactorily to your standards meeting the criteria for believing.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that anyone who I'm talking to about my deconversion would not act like I didn't give it my due diligence.
Right, so that frustrates you when somebody tells you, well, you really didn't think it through, Chris. Come on, right?
Yeah, and when it gets really frustrated, and this kind of gets into kind of more of the subject of your podcast, is there was a period. I talk to religious people. I talk to them in real life at our book club. I also like to get on Facebook groups and Reddit groups and whatnot because I have weird hobbies. And there was a couple months back, there was a period of maybe just a week where all these different groups came at me with the same apologetic, the idea that, Psalm 19, I think, the heavens declare the glory of God.
Yeah.
In Romans 1, God has made himself known through creation so that non-believers are without excuse.
Right.
And that the implication being that non-believers secretly do believe, but they choose to act like they don't believe so that they can continue in their sinful ways. They're putting this this viewpoint on us that simply does not reflect what I believe or the reasons I left the church. And so I kind of find it disingenuous when believers take the word of their 2,000-year-old book over the word of the person who they're speaking with directly in front of them.
Mm-hmm. So you take the idea of, you mentioned Psalm 19, and so when you were a believer, did the universe or the stars or science, did that figure into your deconversion?
In a weird way, it did. I don't think it was the big point that contributed, but so you mentioned on one of your episodes, you quoted Psalm 8, where the psalmist is looking at the heavens, looking at the wonders of it, and then he says, "Who is man that you care for him?"
Right.
Or something along those lines. And that's a good question. I wish he had kind of expounded on that farther, because you think about how mind-bogglingly enormous the universe is, and how much we have yet to even scratch the surface on some of this stuff, and how we're just now seeing light from stars that are already 11 billion years out of date, that they may not even exist anymore. And biblically, all this stuff was created by God in his masterwork. And yet somehow the God that created all this vastness and incredible universe, he cares about me lying to someone, or me coveting my neighbor's cool car, or just
coveting your neighbor's wife or something, adultery.
It seems so petty, in a sense, and it's not to say it's not true. That's why it's a minor point in my opinion, but it's a good question, and I feel like it's more almost hubristic to think that God would care about us than to say that we're special creations made in his image. That just doesn't really resonate with me.
So how would you answer the psalmist's question as an atheist? When I look at the stars and you ask the question, what am I? What is your... I know it must have been difficult to maybe refashion a worldview that you grew up in into something more of your... in regards to atheism. So how do you see, when you look at the stars, how do you answer that question for yourself?
That is a hard question to answer, and it's probably the one that I've wrestled with more than anything else as I've been kind of coming out of my faith. You're led to believe that the creator of the universe cares about your every move. He hand fashioned you in the womb. He has this great plan for your life that's going to leave you happy and fulfilled. In the end, you get to spend eternity with him in heaven. Yeah. And to find out that you're just some other schmuck on a planet of 7 billion other schmucks, and you're not really any more or less special than anyone else, it's kind of a letdown.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of figure, okay, what now? I'm kind of left. If anything, I tend to be more critical of myself than I need to. So when I realize that, oh no, I'm now responsible for my own path through life.
Yeah.
That's not really
it's a hard thing.
It's a daunting prospect.
Yeah, yeah. So you would say that you are in the process of maybe building an answer to that question rather than having a definitive one? Do you, like, in terms of science, I know I don't want to lump all atheists as worshipers of science. I say worshipers of science, but science is often invoked in this discussion about defining who we are. How much in your journey right now would you look at science as informing who you are as a person? The kinds of things that science can't answer: love, wisdom, justice, truth. How do you formulate that? Do you see yourself more scientifically minded than you were prior to being an atheist, or how do you see science informing your beliefs now?
I don't know if it necessarily. Well, there's a difference between like science and philosophy.
Sure.
And science will give us lots of cool stuff to look at and data points to consider and whatnot. But I don't know if it necessarily tells me how to live my life or how to operate in light of that data. So
you have in your atheism you presently leave a legitimate place for philosophy then.
I've very recently. I used to have a really dim view of philosophy.
It's easy to do that because there's so much
I
out
think
there.
That's mainly because I was dealing with random yahoos on the internet, and it's
not
easy
good
for that.
philosophy.
Yeah, it's easy for that to get into wordy mumbo jumbo very quickly.
Right.
But I think there's, and also I don't know if I necessarily want to restrict myself to saying I have a particular ism.
Sure, I understand that. You don't want to be boxed.
I would rather tell someone what I believe, and if that happens to fit into a one-word ism, then okay, so be it. But I'm not sure if I'd want to call myself a subjectivist in terms of meaning, even though it's probably roughly where I'm at right now, just because anytime you give yourself an ism, people think they know.
They go after the box. They go after the ism, not the person.
Yeah, they think they know 900 other things about you because they've also met other people in that ism.
Yeah. And I find that to be true in Christian apologetics. People, I say something about the Bible or the universe, and I'm instantly categorized as a presuppositionalist or a evidentialist or any one of those isms that or being identified as primarily a denomination and not rather a follower of Christ. So if somebody says, you tell somebody you're a Reformed Presbyterian, they're like, oh, bells go off, and then the conversation goes one way because you said Calvin, and so I think the same is true for atheists. A lot of people that I've talked to express the same thing as you do. They don't like to be boxed in. And so would you say it would be accurate then, from what I'm hearing you're saying, that you are a work in progress? You kind of have a colloquial sort of building in progress?
I still have the under construction signs.
Under construction.
I got the caution tape up. But it's a lot to sort through, and it could wind up being a lifelong process.
Sure. Yeah, that's the other interesting thing I find, because people, as we were talking before we turned the mic on, you meet people at different stages in their life, and it may just be a phase or a process through which somebody is going. You could be a Christian again in 10 years, and you just never know. You may stay an atheist for the rest of your life. You meet people in different points along their journey, and you just try to listen and hear what they say from that perspective. So, in regards to, since we agreed to talk about the universe a little bit more detailed. We're not going to get too technical about it. So how would you, right now as you're under construction, how do you view the universe?
I find that I wouldn't call myself a philosophical naturalist, the idea that the natural is absolutely all there is. I probably methodological naturalism in terms of, like, pragmatically, that's really all we can investigate scientifically. the big question I have when people try and invoke the supernatural in terms of explaining things about our world is that I don't really know of a good way to integrate the supernatural with science. Like, so in one of your episodes you brought up the C.S. Lewis's Empty Universe, his essay, which I actually went and read the whole thing.
That's a great...
After that. And he kind of talks like, okay, way back in human history, everything was supernatural. The trees had spirits.
Animism.
The earth had its supernatural elements, and everything kind of had that overarching element to it.
Right.
And then the pendulum swung back from that once we started investigating things scientifically, and now C.S. Lewis is saying it has swung too far back where nothing is supernatural.
We swept out all of the supernatural, and now we've just left laws, mathematical laws, kind of as... he doesn't say this in the essay, but I think his conclusion, I think you've accurately stated it. It's like a family with Christmas decorations in the attic, right? We've stopped celebrating Christmas and we put all the decorations in the attic, but now when we went up to clean the attic, we got rid of the Christmas decorations and there's nothing in the house anymore, nothing celebratory, nothing spiritual, I guess, for lack of a better word. Through the idea of the introduction of mathematical laws, the mathematics have now sort of become causal agents in a sense, and have left us with no supernatural agency. That's the chief nugget of that essay, is what he's arguing. So what do you think about that?
Well, Lewis's point seems to be, okay, the pendulum needs to be somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. And my concern is that I don't know how you determine how far back the pendulum needs to swing. He's like, well, animism is clearly absurd. But a Jew rising from the dead, that's entirely plausible. And God handcrafting stars and giving them their names, that's fine. But to an atheist, those all kind of in the same bucket of weird,
strange.
Weird stuff that you can't really put your finger on necessarily.
Right.
So if you want to bring the supernatural into the discussion, I'm fine with that. I just don't know, once you start invoking supernatural explanations, where do you stop?
You need I think we would both agree you would need some kind of standard to make that assessment. So obviously Lewis's standard is Christianity, right? It seems to be, a lot of people would say he's begging the question. He doesn't get explicitly Christian in that essay. He wrote it for an introduction to a book. You can go back and listen to the podcast. I've forgotten the book that I mentioned, but no, Lewis is not explicitly Christian, but his presupposition is Christ.
Yeah, you know where he's coming from.
Yeah, you know where he's coming from. So he starts with a measuring line. He's using, as Galileo said, there are two books. We have the book of nature and scripture. But a lot of people like yourself, skeptics, will say, it seems to beg the question that you begin with Christianity. Why that set of standards? Does that sound, is that kind of where your question is? Why do we begin there? Or why that's plumb line? Why Christ? Why the Bible?
Well, I don't think necessarily that we start with Christianity, but if we start accepting Christian explanations for things, why do we not start thinking about fairies or ghosts or spirits or?
So I hear what you're saying. So Jesus rising from the dead. Okay, if you let that in, how far out do we go in supernatural manifestations of things in our world? So we would need a standard for supernatural.
Or even if you stay within Christianity, people will, or apologists will, when they talk about the resurrection, be like, well, if you assume God, then the resurrection is no more implausible than anything else.
Yeah, that's the traditional theistic argument.
But if you have if you start bringing in an all-powerful God into the realm of possible explanations for things, you have to factor that into literally anything you're looking for an explanation for. Like, I don't know how murder investigations work in that world. Like, find a guy with a bullet in his head, and you have to think, well, was he shot by someone, or did the all-powerful God teleport a bullet into his brain? Like,
So we're both talking about the idea that we need a standard to assess whether or not a supernatural explanation is the best explanation for something that we witness. Does that sound accurate?
Probably winding up there, although I guess maybe before we get there, we need to think about, okay, do we invoke supernatural explanations at all?
Okay, so let's start there. Why? So you're hesitant to even put that on the table, if you will. Why don't you explain that a little bit?
Part of my problem is that the term supernatural, right? That seems to be, in terms of the common parlance at least, that's the realm where we put all the weird stuff that we can't explain right now.
Okay.
And I don't know. I kind of feel like, to a certain extent, anyone who's at all scientifically minded, or for whom science in some way informs their view of the world, we kind of have to make a bet, right, in terms of what science will discover in our lifetimes versus after we pass on, because there's always a chance that every now and again they make these huge world-shattering discoveries that upend everything we thought we knew about the universe.
Right.
And with my luck, that'll happen the day after I die, so that I won't be able to factor that in.
Yeah, right.
So we're kind of having to kind of judge things by where they're at right now and by what their track record has been.
Would you agree? I think David Hume had a generic. I'm not familiar with all his points in great detail, but I know that the gist of Hume's objections to the supernatural, or miracles, if you will, was that they are rare, and therefore, by their rarity, they're defined as supernatural. Would you agree that supernature, if it existed, or miracles? I'm kind of enjoining both supernatural and the miraculous together, kind of as an assumption. Would you would posit that if we're going to talk about them, that they are rare occurrences? Would you, if granted, if they exist, that they're rare, that's part of what makes it at least make us think that it's supernatural? Would you?
Right. Yeah, I'd grant that.
Okay, so it would be a rare event. But then Hume says, I think he says that we should base our logic and thinking on events that are much more less rare, right? Like the sun rising or the moon out last night. We should think in terms of miracles, in terms of their frequency happening in our everyday experience. That we don't experience people rising from the dead, in Hume's mind, cast doubt on the actual resurrection. Does that sound like your position accurately explained?
Yeah, and that's what I mean by going by track records of things, because the history of science has been, people have a supernatural explanation for something, we dig into it, and we find that actual explanation is entirely mundane and natural. And there's always going to be stuff that we can't investigate fully with science, like historical stuff like the resurrection.
Right.
So we need to kind of, once again, we have to kind of take a gamble on that maybe and say, okay, let's not even take Jesus rising from the dead. He's not the only one who's ever been claimed to rise from the dead. The Mormons have their claims about Joseph Smith raising, and there's other, I'm sure. So any
Muhammad going to heaven on a winged horse.
Yeah. So any given resurrection story, we kind of think, okay, that usually doesn't happen, and these people have a agenda for saying it did happen. Maybe it just didn't happen like that.
Maybe they're making it up.
Right.
Is that what you're suggesting?
Or maybe they're mistaken. I don't want to attribute malice.
Okay, so some people will say they're, as you know, we travel in the same kind of circles. Atheists will say, disciples made it up, or there's a lot of that. But you're saying, you're a little bit more charitable there, and you're saying maybe they made a mistake. Maybe they're just mistaken in their thinking or deceived or something.
Yeah, because I mean, one thing that apologists will say, and they do have a good point, is that there were a lot of early Christians, early disciples who died for what they believed.
Sure.
Paul went so far as to get beheaded for his belief.
Sure.
And he had some sort of experience that he attributed to the risen Lord, and so I don't cast doubt that the disciples were sincere in what they believed. I just think that they were incorrect about what they believed.
You believe they saw something?
I don't know if they saw something or someone else saw something and reported it to them. I know the Bible says they all had the experience with the risen Christ in one room, and so if we take that literally, then we're talking about a group hallucination, which it would be weird.
That would be weird,
for sure.
Well, what's the last time we had any kind of example of a group hallucination leading to a movement? Would have been the 1960s, right? Woodstock.
Yeah, well, there may have been some mitigating factors in there.
Exactly.
As I make the joint smoking.
But that kind of group hallucination didn't lead to much, except maybe the Beatles.
Yeah, but in terms of is there a more mundane explanation for what happened? Then they all saw the resurrected Christ. Maybe there were reports that were exaggerated. Maybe one of them saw Christ, and then in the intervening time until the Gospels written down, that story morphed into all the disciples saw the risen Christ.
So let me ask you a couple questions, and you can take one or the other. So the first question, let's get back to the idea of miracles and what counts as supernature. Mm-hmm. And if we agree that a miracle or the appearance of supernatural breaking into the natural world, that would depend on whether or not we believe the universe is an open or closed system, right? So you described methodological naturalism a minute ago, which posits that the physical world is the only thing that can be studied. There are different shades of methodological naturalism, but basically it's the scientist's tool for, I don't want to lump it as a presupposition, but for some people it kind of is, that this is the only way we can investigate. Some physicists, scientists, just assume it, don't think much about it. It's just, hey, I look at leaves of the trees, I look at stars, this is just what I see, blah, blah, blah. But there are other people that I think take methodological naturalism one step further and say it inevitably leads to a philosophical naturalism. If I'm being methodologically naturalistic in my day-to-day work, then why wouldn't I just be a practical naturalist in my day-to-day life? But let's talk about the rarity for a second. Do you think, if we are talking about the advent of the supernatural as a rare event, how would it be possible in your mind to classify the existence of the universe as a rare event? That its origin, whether I'm just postulating and allowing for possibilities, if the multiverse or however it came about, that it seems to be, at present, the scientific consensus seems to be that somehow our universe, given matter and energy and entropy, had a beginning. So would you think, would that a rare event, would you think that would be allowable as perhaps evidence of supernatural, or is that a kind of special pleading? What do you think?
Well, this kind of gets into what I was talking about as far as, making a bet on what we currently know scientifically. Right now, to my knowledge, we don't have a rigorous scientific explanation for what originally set off the Big Bang.
Yeah, because the Big Bang, you're right, because the Big Bang doesn't actually include the bang.
Yeah,
it happened like a split second afterwards.
We have models up to like some microseconds.
Yeah, 10 to the negative 43. It's 10 with a decimal point.
I don't even know what the prefix is for that.
It's a Planck time, I think they call it. So it's like a decimal point followed by 43 zeros and a 1. Mm-hmm. That's what current cosmological theories allegedly trace back to, but what triggered that event is, depending on who you talk to, a ridiculous idea or an idea worth studying, or people that are postulating things. Peter Atkins just came out with a book this year where he takes Lawrence Krauss's universe from nothing one step further, and he means he thinks the universe came from absolutely philosophically nothing. But getting back to all that, Do you think that the arising of the universe would count as supernature? You said earlier we kind of make a bet. Well, expand on that. That's interesting to me.
Okay, so let's use the origin of the universe as an example.
Okay.
So right now, we don't know what set off the Big Bang. We don't know. I don't want to say before the Big Bang because that's kind of
an anomaly, yeah.
But we don't know if everything came from a singularity. We don't know where the singularity came from.
When you say we,
with air quotes.
When you say we, we're talking about naturalistic science.
I'm talking about humanity as a whole, the entire body of human knowledge. We don't have that in our quiver right now. So now we have an open question here of what set all this off to begin with. And so we kind of have a choice to make. We can take a supernatural explanation, God did it, and right now I can't say anything to the contrary of that because I don't know. So we can say God did it, or we can say some currently unknown natural explanation for that. So it's possible that 24 hours after I die, some brilliant scientist comes up with a model that explains it all perfectly.
Yeah.
But I can't necessarily pin my hopes on that specifically. And
so you're not of the camp that says you're not pronouncing that science will find something. You're a little bit more open to the. Are you open to the possibility of supernatural explanation? Or are you just thinking that you're condemned to a hard agnosticism for the rest of your life?
I kind of go by like I was saying before, I go by the track record of we take these supernatural explanations for things. Like we used to think that lightning was Thor striking.
Sure.
I shouldn't say we, 'cause the Norse.
Yeah.
But they used to think, lightning was Thor striking his mighty hammer.
Yeah, Valhalla and hammer time in Valhalla.
Yeah, or that the sun moving across the sky was Apollo and his mighty
and his
chariot
sure.
or whatnot. And we've since discovered natural explanations for these things, that the gods that we used to think were responsible for certain phenomena are not actually responsible. So if I were making a bet here, I would place my bet on a unknown but natural explanation over a supernatural one, just because that seems to be the trend.
We seem to find so for you it sounds like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I just want to make sure I'm catching you right, that kind of what you're saying is kind of affirming what Lewis said, that natural laws do replace deities.
That seems to be the case, yeah.
Okay. So the idea that now, okay, so let me ask you this. I know neither of us are scientists, and I always try to trod lightly in these topics, but do you think, you personally, Chris, do you think that natural explanations, say like gravity or laws of planetary motion or the four fundamental forces, any kind of scientific or mathematical description, do you think that these laws are causal, that they have causal agency? In other words, that they actually do things, or are they descriptions of things that we don't yet know what is happening? You know, is the difference
right,
clear?
Yeah, it's a prescriptive versus descriptive.
Right.
Do you think
so? Do you think that the law that lies behind the beginning of the universe, or whatever law, do you think these are merely descriptive, or do you think they have causal prescriptive properties?
I think they're descriptive. I think they're us trying to explain how things do work rather than what actually caused them to work to begin with.
Okay, so you would allow for something to be behind the laws themselves.
Yeah, and I'm not going to come out and say there is absolutely no supernatural explanation out there. I just haven't.
You're hesitant.
I just haven't found a good way to investigate that or sort through all the supernatural possibilities that people want to throw out for there. I mean, look at all the. If you want to talk about the creation of the universe, look at all the creation myths from all the civilizations over the course of human history.
Sure.
And they all kind of fit into that same bucket and seem to explain things as far as people thought. And I don't know why we would necessarily say Jehovah God created the universe and not say, not pick the Babylonian myths or some African tribal myth.
Yeah. Do you think that it seems like in the history of astronomy, just limiting it to the heavens here, that most of the historical explanations all the way back to ancient times that ascribe a deity or deities to the universe's existence is something that will eventually pass out of human thought altogether? Or is there, in other words, it seems like atheism really is the one among the many that kind of makes the claim that naturalistic explanations are the best, despite all the theistic explanations that have preceded it. Are you suggesting that maybe science, and coupled with a sort of naturalistic, philosophical naturalism, is a better explanation than any kind of theism or any kind of supernaturalism?
It at least lets us kind of settle some things, I guess. Not that, like I said, not that any theory couldn't be overturned with new information, but if that's the whole thing about the supernatural, is that it's so. On the one hand, it's a better explanation sometimes because it is an explanation for things that right now science can't explain. So I guess it's better in that sense. But at the same time, it's also a assertion that we can't really. Coming back to this, it's kind of an assertion that we can't really investigate farther. Like if we want to.
It doesn't have a physicalist property.
Yeah, we can't do experiments on God. We can't point to God with data. We can infer God with data, as many Christian scientists have done. But it's just outside the realm of science as we currently operate.
Okay. So in that regard, you had mentioned in our emails, we were talking about Psalm 19 and that ancient declaration that the heavens declare the glory of God. So how do you see that in the modern world? How do you see that for yourself? Does that have any relevance today, or is that something that how do you square that today with walking away from the faith? What's your take on that text in terms of what it's saying about the universe?
Well, I would think that text would resonate more with people who already believe in God.
Yeah.
And therefore they would be prone to seeing God in all sorts of things, in all sorts of ways that non-believers wouldn't see him. Like, I'm sure that if the ancient Egyptian pantheon were still a major world belief, then like people would be working at solar observatories to learn more about the wonder of Ra, or something like that. Like, you can look at the heavens and see the wonder of whatever pantheon you currently believe in.
Yeah. A funny aside, I should tell you, this is just completely random. You mentioned Ra, the sun god, and when I was taking Hebrew in seminary about 5 years ago, I took a few weeks of a course of Hebrew. It was really fun, and we learned the word Ra in Hebrew. It means evil. It means it's a verb tense of the verb to see in Hebrew, and it also means evil. And so I jokingly asked the Hebrew professor, I said, how do you say I see the evil sun god in Hebrew? Ra, 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 ra.
So anyway, their cheerleaders must be easily misunderstood.
What are they saying? I see an evil sun god? But anyway, so here's a declaration that's saying that the universe, the heavens declare the glory of God. And so for you as an atheist, you are agnostic on that point until you don't think there's a scientific way to do that. Is there another way that we could find out whether or not that was true other than a methodological naturalism?
Yeah, I don't know how scientifically we can answer questions of glory.
Yeah.
It's a value judgment. I'm sure there's some people who look up in the heavens and are with no imagination, and it's like, oh, that's neat,
cool, whatever.
What's on TV? What are the Kardashians up to, or whatever?
Right.
And so some people just don't give a rip about that.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, some people are more interested and more prone to wonder and awe, that kind of thing. And for me, and I'm sure for many other people who don't ascribe to a deity, space is pretty cool on its own.
It sure is.
And you can enjoy it and take in the new scientific discoveries. Like after I left the faith, this may a year or two ago, is when the NASA probe went by Pluto.
Yeah.
And so when I was a kid and I was into astronomy and stuff like that, all we had were these like little blurry, low-res images where this dot is Pluto and
looked like a luminous Q-tip.
Yeah, exactly. And now all of a sudden we're coming in with these high-res images of what it actually looks like.
Yeah.
And that's really cool.
It's amazing.
And I looked on those and I thought it was really interesting, and I didn't even need to invoke God to say, hey, look at this cool planet God made. I could just say, look at this cool planet, because it's still a planet to me.
Yeah.
But it's...
Do you think that wow factor for you how would you explain that? That wow factor is a fascinating thing. Carl Sagan talked about it. He says when we look at the stars and the sun and the universe, there's a kernel of awe, A-W-E, that is within each one of us when we look up at the universe. The wow factor, the really coolness of the universe, the enjoyability of the universe. Mm-hmm. In it, how do you sort of account for the intelligibility that we can send a probe? We little humans on a little blue dot can send a probe and get really cool pictures of a distant world. How do you reconcile the intelligibility of the universe with within a naturalistic perspective? I don't want to box you in, of course. I'm not saying you're a naturalist, but in terms of just your own point of view, how do you see the intelligibility of the cosmos? Why are we able to see and understand so much of it? What do you think?
Well, I don't know what an unintelligible universe looks like.
We've only been in one that we can understand, right?
Yeah, and if you want to put out multiverse theory, I'm not sure where I stand on that. But maybe there are unintelligible universes out there that didn't amount to much because of that fact. I guess I don't see where our ability to understand something means that a god did it. You know what?
No, I'm not putting that out there in that question. I'm just wondering how you would sort of reconcile that. What is the intelligibility factor? Is that happenstance, do you think? I mean, obviously, I'm coming from the perspective of an intelligent creator created the universe and therefore made it intelligible for us. But as an atheist, I was just curious to know how you see the intelligibility. Or is that still a work in progress as you're restructuring your worldview?
I guess it's kind of a big, kind of meta question.
It is.
That I almost kind of... I probably need to think about that a little more, but my gut reaction is that's kind of a... Like I said, we don't know if the universe could have been unintelligible. It's coming from the Big Bang. It's kind of, we're looking at things the way they are, and I don't know if it could have been any different. So it's almost like I don't know if that's even a relevant question.
Okay. So you're familiar, I don't want to get too terribly technical, I promised I wouldn't, but I think this is something that we both probably understand to some degree. So in the very early universe, the principal two elements that were present, theoretically, were hydrogen in mass and helium, and that they, after the universe cooled, after the hot, dense expansion of the universe, as the cooling period happening, only hydrogen and helium were present in abundance. Mm-hmm. You follow that?
Right.
That's pretty simple. Mm-hmm. So over the course of, 9 billion years, or if you have biological evolution at about 4.5 billion years, mm-hmm. Do you, because to me it seems fantastic that hydrogen and helium, the only two elements that existed in abundance in the early universe, inevitably, even if it's over long eons of time, formed. So a colorless, odorless, inert gas came together and created us. Or I say created, for lack of a better word. Isn't that equally as fantastic? I mean, whether or not, I don't think, so you have two possibilities. You have the naturalistic possibility that this stuff just sort of coalesced randomly over time, or you have the possibility that God formed it over time. But do you think that there's not that the idea of hydrogen and helium just sort of randomly colliding in an early universe, yielding human beings eventually, isn't that just as equally fantastic? Do you think that you find that just incredible?
So, once again, this is with a huge disclaimer that maybe we figured this out in 50 years' time.
Uh-huh.
But so right now
for you,
we have a fantastic option, and we have a fantastic option plus God.
Yeah.
So if you want to invoke the one where God is the extra option, I guess you can. I can't stop you, but let's study this some more and see if we can't figure it out.
So you're still open to the question of how the ancient gas formed, coalesced, created stars, created us. You're still thinking that maybe down the road there would be some naturalistic explanation for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see people keep investigating it, and I like to see our body of knowledge grow, and maybe we make some cool discoveries that I am here to see and enjoy. Okay,
so to kind of summarize, your position on supernatural and miracles is somewhat, for you, is somewhat undefined. You feel that there's not the boundaries of how to determine the standards by which we assess these claims is still fuzzy. Is that accurate? Or are you still?
Yeah, I think I'm sure you're familiar with the term God of the gaps.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
If people want to put God in as a placeholder explanation for stuff that we don't currently understand, mm-hmm. I'm fine with that. I understand why people would do that. Just for me, I see how often God keeps getting pushed back. There's always going to be stuff we don't understand.
Yeah.
That you can put God in there.
Sure.
But we keep pushing God further and further back, and it's kind of like a never-ending cycle of we put God, we posit God as an explanation, we figure out how that thing works, but then we discover 3 other things that we don't know how they work. Mm-hmm. So God goes in the explanation of those. And it just kind of seems to me to be an inefficient way of doing things when time and time again we discover that God is the wrong answer.
Yeah. So like I introduced you to my friend Jill today, right? Mm-hmm. She made our power coffee at Buongiorno in South Lake, Texas. You need to come by, get power coffee from Jill in Buongiorno in South Lake, Texas. That's where we are today. She's wonderful. She's a barista, very talented. What do you think of the coffee? Was it really good?
It was good. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was very good. So what I think, this is just where I'm coming from, that the God of the gaps, as I've come to understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to say this is your view per se, mm-hmm. but we find, so let's take gravity, right? So
sure.
Newton explained it one way.
Mm-hmm.
Spooky action at a distance, right? This invisible force guides the motion of bodies. The farther away they are, there's a proportional weakening mm-hmm. of the force. Einstein comes along a couple hundred years later, and he says, "No, it's not an invisible force. It's an invisible fabric. Space-time mm-hmm. fabric is warped by the gravitation, by the mass." Mm-hmm. So we have these 2 explanations of gravity, which are fantastic, and they're both true at a certain level, but at other levels, they contravene each other, right? Mm-hmm. So I look at it this way. We can explain all the ingredients of the power coffee and we can explain the mechanism about how Jill made the power coffee. We can explain the espresso machine and the hot water and the boiling and the ingredients and the butter and the coconut. I think there's coconut in there as well. Coconut butter. Yeah. But even if we have all of that, that doesn't do away with Jill, right? Because the mechanisms by themselves couldn't make the power coffee without Jill. So rather than saying, because I understand, I do agree with you. I think there is a simplistic way of saying, well, we don't know, therefore God did it, and then God is replaced when we have a natural explanation. I used to think that way, and I think there's a lot of people that do. But I think for the more thorough thinking through it, I think that you can have that naturalistic law that's not causal. It's just what's the one we came up with a minute ago? Not causal, but
Descriptive.
Descriptive, not prescriptive. So we can have a descriptive understanding of the mechanisms behind what a barista uses. But even if we could explain all of that, that doesn't do away with Jill, right? So we could say Jill is a perfectly legitimate. She's the causal reason for making all of the laws of the mechanics of the espresso machine work. So for me, and I don't even know if this is the proper way to do it myself, but this is kind of what I've concluded, that you can have a completely legitimate explanation. You can have all the laws, the four fundamental forces, but you still have Jill behind them all. So even if we come up with everything, and you say that, oh, look, here's how hot water and coffee, and here's how that all works, that doesn't do away with baristas. Does that make sense? Does that?
It does. Let's take the same analogy from the atheist perspective.
Sure.
So, Jill is, as far as I know, having just met her, a natural person.
Yeah.
Where we got and of course we know all the mechanisms behind how coffee is made and whatnot.
Right.
From an atheist perspective, it seems like believers are taking all this stuff that we understand to be natural, and they're saying, oh, thank you, God, for giving Jill this talent to make coffee and come up with these recipes and so forth. But from our perspective, you don't need to bring God into the equation at all. We still, the coffee still tastes great.
Yeah.
It's not bad coffee because it doesn't have supernatural magic behind it. We can enjoy it for what it is and be in awe of the talent, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So I see. I probably should clarify my analogy. In my analogy, the mechanisms of the espresso machine are the laws of the universe, the things that we can explain about the espresso. And Jill is God, in scare quotes, right? And that's how I see the relationship of the universe. But of course, God as the ultimate barista. I hate to put it that way, but he creates the espresso out of nothing. The creation ex nihilo. And so any kind of law that is descriptive points back to a lawgiver. So to avoid being guilty of the God of the gaps, like black holes, right? Complete mystery. There's a lot we know, but there's a lot that's fundamentally we don't know. Or dark matter, or dark energy. These great mysteries that are in the universe that envelop cosmologists right now. I'm not saying that, okay, dark matter, therefore God, because somebody may find a dark matter particle. Or a dark energy particle, whatever's causing the universe to expand, if it's expanding as they theorize. I wouldn't say, oh, God is expanding the universe, and then they find an expansion particle of energy or whatever, and then God is eliminated. I wouldn't do that. If they found the particle, I'd still invoke Jill. Well, Jill's the one that put the particle there. It was a mystery for us to explore. So I think the difference, the God of the gaps thing really boils down to the difference between whether or not one thinks a law is causal or descriptive. I think that's where it boils down to, because what ends up happening in the argument is that when a naturalist, I'm not saying you, but when a naturalist would say, oh, we found a law, therefore we don't need God, like Laplace, the Napoleon's mathematician, who said he could mathematically tease out the universe to the nth position, and he has no need of God's hypothesis because he has the math. But I think that's the argument that makes laws causal and not descriptive. And I think that's where the fault is in that discussion, is whether or not you think laws are causal and that they can replace God as a causal agent rather than just being descriptive. Do you think you see that?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think kind of where the philosophy comes in is that, I mean, whatever science discovers, there's always going to be room in there for God somewhere.
I think so.
If you want to put him in there.
Yeah. You're just saying that for you, it's how do I determine that? How do you determine?
Partially, I don't know how to determine that. I don't know how to determine which God.
Yeah.
And I just don't see a need to invoke God at all to try and, in terms of how I'm viewing the universe and how things seem to be operating.
Where do you think the cool factor comes in for you in the universe? What you were explaining, how it's delightful to see Pluto in HD. How do you? Because it's, to me, it is a wonder whether God is invoked or not to explain how it is this delight that we have, because that's intrinsically not physical, but it seems to belie methodological naturalism, that I'm in profound awe, or whatever you want to, coolness, or whatever you want to call it, tingly joy, or when I look at the heavens and wow, that goes beyond a methodological naturalist. You can't sort of analyze the awe. In other words, how do you explain that cool factor about the heavens? What do you think?
I don't know if methodological naturalism would explain that, but I also don't know if theism explains that either. Okay. So there's probably some scientist who knows the answer to this and is going to be very angry with me.
That's okay. That we're laymen. We put the disclaimer out there. That's okay.
Yes, huge
disclaimer.
The biggest asterisk you can muster, 72-point font on this.
That's right. That's what we do. Asterisks are all over our podcast. That's it.
But so I don't know if we have a evolutionary explanation for our ability to appreciate beauty.
There you go.
Or to check out cool artwork, or enjoy cool music, or enjoy a cool look through the telescope at the moon, or something like that.
Yeah.
Because, if evolution is survival of the fittest, natural selection, and it boils down to what makes you more able to survive and pass on your genes, I don't know where me listening to Nirvana fits into that, or whatever.
Right. But it may preclude your demise rather than aid your survival.
Depending on what depressing music I want to listen to. But also from the theistic side, there's no real reason for God to give us that capacity either. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but it's not necessary for us to understand that we are sinful beings and Jesus died on the cross for us, and we want to believe in God in order to go to heaven.
Yeah.
It almost seems kind of a bonus from no matter which way you look at it.
Yeah, you've described what I think kind of plagues a lot of evangelicalism of the last century or more. As you and I both know, because we delve into the apologetic circles, the approach of a very minimal facts-based understanding of the gospel. John 3:16, and a very slimmed-down version, a couple of verses from Romans, and then John 3:16, and a very simplistic. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, but it becomes a very straitened gospel message, right? So that, as you just said, the heavens look like a superfluous and unnecessary addition. If all I need to know is the gospel, if all I need to do is repent of my sins and believe in Jesus, then the universe and rosebuds and willow trees and blue whales all seem kind of superfluous to the toned down or the slimmed down message of the gospel. Whereas I think what's happened in the last 100 or 150 years, if you want to go back to Darwin, or even if you want to go back to Copernicus, that I think we would probably agree on this, I think, that the church has slowly surrendered its care of the first book to the secular sciences. Would you agree? Would you see more of a transition from the church being the sort of the steward of the creation, giving that over to a more methodological naturalism over the last maybe 500 years, 400 or 500 years? Do you think that's a problem for the church as you see it?
It's interesting to see the change that has taken place as Darwin has come on the scene, and I'm probably thinking mainly of the Catholic Church. I know the Catholic Church has accepted evolution as as valid, and they work it into their doctrine. And this is one of those areas where Christianity has to reckon with science, because there are certainly believers, Francis Collins for one, among others, that take no issue with evolution, and they've found ways to adapt it.
Theistic evolution.
Yeah, it doesn't shake their faith in the slightest, but at the same time, it does raise valid questions about the accounts of Genesis. Like, if evolution was true, then there's ways that God could have communicated that to us without... Because if evolution is true, Adam and Eve probably didn't exist.
That's something that you would say. Yeah, when was the first human in an evolutionary construct? Who or when was the first human, right?
I mean, we have mitochondrial Adam, mitochondrial Eve, but they lived thousands of years apart, and as far as we know, there was never that bottleneck where everything genetically can be traced back to two people. I think the smallest population is maybe 10,000 individuals or something like that. Look it up online if you want the actual picture from scientists. But that's a legit challenge, and I now recognize. I mentioned earlier that I was creation versus evolution is one of the things that I looked into that kind of pushed me out of the faith, and I now realize that doesn't need to, because you have theistic evolutionists. That's a thing, but when you're led to believe that Genesis 1, Genesis 2 is literally how it happened, and you're listening to people like a Ken Ham or a Kent Hovind or someone who that's their bread and butter is bolstering those accounts, then once you realize that may not be accurate, then it kind of sends you on a rabbit hole of what else in this book isn't accurate. And that was one of the things. I don't know if you were with us when we read the Francis Collins book.
I had not been in part of the club before then.
So he brings up that very notion that, to his fellow Christians, your ignorance of evolution and science in general is going to keep causing problems for your kids as they get out into the world and they find out that this stuff actually has reasoning behind it and is more legit than you're telling them, because it's going to send them down those roads.
So I think he's saying that I've read The Language of God many years ago, and I think that's the continual struggle for a believer, is to be to rightly understand. I mean, Augustine wrote about this centuries ago. Being well informed by contemporary science, so that you are at least conversant with the idea of what the theory says. Now, you may not have to, you don't have to necessarily agree with it, but you would at least, I think the onus is on a believer to be aware of what it's saying. Like you did, you delved into it, and you can look into this for yourself. These are issues that, in this day and age of information, technology and books, you can read about this and draw your own conclusions. So in the naturalistic worldview, that's a traditional conflict between Darwinian evolution or neo-Darwinian evolution and the literal reading of Genesis. Of course, Darwin's theory was that he doesn't deal with the origin of life, what we call abiogenesis, right? He just, like the Big Bang, he takes it right after the appearance of life and just explains how he sees the development of life over eons of time. And so what Darwinian natural selection needs is a long period of time for life to gradually, slowly evolve, right? Do you find there's a similarity between the origins explanation of the universe and abiogenesis, and then later the development of natural selection? Do you see that life coming from a tiny amoeba-like entity, one single biological entity, and the universe coming from one sort of subatomic particle bursting into all of this flora and fauna? Do you think there's a similarity there? Because when you read about stars, the evolution of stars, the evolution of galaxies, the evolution of the universe, in some sense, that invokes in the minds of believers the idea that the same sort of standards that we apply to biological life are being applied to the universe. Have you heard that before?
Yeah, I mean, that's another one of those open questions that we are continually looking for models, and we're getting, I think, better ideas in that area. Like, we know that you can find amino acids in space, and we can see where RNA molecules can self-form in laboratory conditions and whatnot. So we have inklings of maybe how it could have happened, but kind of like the ultimate origin of the universe, there's still room there to put in God if you want.
How would you agree with the assessment? I know a lot of apologists will say this, and even some scientists, and I know Carl Sagan said it a lot. The idea that DNA and RNA contain information. How are you with that term? Do you think it's just metaphorical, or how do you reconcile that? Do you think that, because DNA does seem to be like information as we know it? How did the cells get the? Now I know A, C, T, and G are just what we've called these things, but in calling them that, they do seem to be patternistic. It does seem to be everything that we would call information. Do you find that to be just a metaphor, or because to me, here's the weird thing. So we have, let's assume, for argument's sake, that natural selection is true. It has bequeathed to us a language that can only speak of it as though it were an intelligence. It's kind of funny. I didn't say funny, but it's kind of weird that the only language that we can use to describe natural selection is that of a selector. We posit nature with all sorts of sentient qualities, that she does this, and that the cells have information in them. Do you find that, is there a better way to describe this than all this anthropological language, or is that what we're stuck with? Or why do you think natural selection has to be described with terms like that? Did you find that unusual? I think that's my chief objection to natural selection, or at least that's a paradox that I see. Maybe it's resolvable, but why are we continually resorting to language that bespeaks of intelligence when we talk about this process? It's kind of a paradox, I guess, if you will.
That is a really good question for someone who knows way more about genetics and.
But let's go back to just simply DNA. You know what that is, right? That's the stuff from which our they code and makes our proteins, makes amino acids, makes our genes and molecules, makes our hair and our eyes and all that. So, do you think that's information? Is that accurate to call that information, or do you think that that's just a metaphor?
I'd be okay with calling it information, but I don't think that necessarily invokes I have more issue with terms like the genetic program or something like that I've heard from apologists, because I think that's a loaded term, because they want to go from that to there's a program, therefore there is a programmer. Or something along those lines.
Yeah, Sagan uses the idea of information encyclopedias and libraries in his one of his episodes, and in the book Cosmos, and then in the book Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. Both he and his wife Andrian talk about DNA like a library, like information. Of course, he doesn't, like you, he hesitates to make that as evidence of a creator or evidence of intelligence. So you would call it information, but you would leave open the possibility maybe there's a natural explanation for where that came from.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be fully honest here. I'm not super well read on that subject.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, stars, in terms of evidence for the supernatural, given everything you've said, you would say that a star would, according to science, would be just a huge ball of flaming gas and nothing more, right? That's where you're at with it right now?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. So, when it comes to theistic explanations, how do you, as an atheist, assess theistic claims? Because I don't know if you remember, it was the last episode or last podcast that you sat in for Jim, where we were talking to Owen and Rex, and we got into talking about stars before the camera shut off, I think it was. And I don't remember if this was on the camera or not, so forgive me for this. But we got into this issue of stars and what constitutes evidence for a divine being. And this is a chief question I always ask all my atheist acquaintances, so I'm putting you under the microscope too. It's okay. If you don't want to answer it, that's fine. So what would constitute, so as an atheist, you reject, or at least are skeptical of theistic claims. Is that for you, Chris? I don't want to, is that accurate?
That's fair to say.
Okay. So when you assess theistic claims, Do you see it as a theological assessment nonetheless? Because if you say God does not or likely does not exist, do you have a set of standards that would reveal to you a theistic or a divine being? Mm-hmm. So, like, the simple analogy is, like, I know that there's no evidence of socks in my dryer, my running socks in my dryer, because I know what socks look like. Mm-hmm. So when you are, and I let me affirm that I am a skeptic too when it comes to, we're all skeptics, but skepticism, I think, implies a standard of truth. Wouldn't you agree? So we can be skeptical about somebody says, hey, I want to sell you this or that beachfront property in Oklahoma.
Yeah, you have to be able to evaluate
exactly.
these claims.
So I think this was the second issue that you wanted to talk about, was evaluating the miracles, the naturalism. When it comes to God's existence or that kind of thing, for the skeptic, do you see that there is some kind of an imposition of a theological standard nonetheless? You haven't seen evidence for a God, but to me, that implies you would know if you did see it. Mm-hmm. You think that's Rex or Owen said that that's a question that switches the burden of proof, and maybe it does, but given so like Christians, we bear, like the apologists try to bear the burden of proof, but they finally are told a lot of times that when we ask a skeptic to counter, oftentimes the charge, I'm not saying you do this, but the charge is that we are shifting the burden of proof. Do you think that question about the standard for evidence of God is a burden shifting, or do you have a certain standard of what would convince you of God's existence? It's a long question, but
no, I get it. And I haven't asked it before. I look at it like, okay, let's put a different question. Let's say, is there a 10th planet outside the solar system that we have yet to discover? Or just, is it out there? I have no reason to think there is right now.
Yeah.
And maybe someday we come up with some sort of data that there is one, but for right now, I don't actively disbelieve that there is one. I just have no reason to think that there is.
And in that analogy, we know what a planet would be, right?
Right, we know we've discovered planets before.
So we have a standard.
Take.
Right.
So as far as the God question, you're right. I mean, it's possible. I mean, there's no theological claim that you can't be skeptical about. Just some level. And there's certainly an unhealthy level of skepticism where you doubt everything.
But you would agree, and I think we would agree, that we should inquire and be critical in our thinking about theological claims. Would you?
Right,
Yeah.
and then the more detailed those claims are, the more information we have to evaluate them.
Right.
So if we're thinking about the Christian God, for example, this is a God that apparently loves me and really wants me to believe in him, and really does not want me to go to hell.
No.
He wants me to believe that Jesus died for my sins and accept that sacrifice and his grace so that I go to heaven and spend eternity with him.
Yeah.
So if that God loves me and has the power to communicate this message to me, why hasn't he done so effectively, in my opinion? God has the power to, if he wanted to, he could come down from heaven, bonk me on the head, and say, believe in me, dummy.
Yeah.
He could do that. And I would think that if he loves me and wants me to know him, then he would do that, because he knows that I kind of need that right now, apparently.
Yeah.
Because, I know Christians would say, I have the Bible already, that should be sufficient. Yeah. And it's just not.
Right.
Like, the more I look into it, the more I see issues with it. But I've never had that profound personal experience that some Christians would claim. Okay. And it's not to say that I couldn't write it off as a hallucination or some bad Taco Bell the night before or something like that, but at least make me think for 2 seconds.
Sure.
Like right now, I've been for as difficult as certain, meaning type questions have been, not going to church for 5 years has been pretty easy to do.
Sure.
Aside from the meta questions of how I'm going to live my life now, not a whole lot has changed. So maybe God's going to show up here next few years and give me some experience that I really need to reckon with, and I'm going to continue with my disbelief. But that I think that's the kind of thing it would take.
So what I hear you saying is that in your state of being unconvinced of the gospel message, given the importance of it, what's at stake, that one of the criteria is being convinced. Is that accurate? You would say that what gives you doubt is remaining in your doubt, that God hasn't really given you the experience or the evidence that you're looking for to convince you of the message. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Well, what I mean is to say, you can doubt anything.
Sure.
And then there's always going to be a leap of faith at some level, because we're just not going to understand everything about the Bible, about the gospel,
so when you
about
say,
God himself.
I don't mean to interrupt you, the leap of faith, like epistemically, are you talking about from your perspective? Is that you're not talking just religious, but you're just in general about our knowledge of things? A leap of faith? What do you mean by that?
Well, here's what I mean. I don't think you would say you understand everything about God.
Oh, absolutely not.
Absolutely not. So,
heavens no.
But you still believe in God.
Yes.
And you have enough in your own mind to say, okay, there's still stuff I don't understand.
Right.
But I'm going to hang my hat on this nonetheless.
Yeah, it's a faith that is an active. I'd say it's a belief. It's an active belief. So I could just make an intellectual assent and not do anything. That's not faith. But an intellectual assent, a trust in a proposition, and putting that propositional trust into action. So you take, you know who Anthony Magnabosco is, right?
Yes.
Street Epistemology. He read Peter Boghossian's book, and he literally went out and did what Dr. Boghossian said. That, and it's all about epistemology. And that is kind of the same thing in some very superficial sense of what Christians do. We read a book and we go out and we live it. And I think that's the active faith. For me, that's what faith is. It's not belief without evidence. It's like, here's a body of knowledge. Okay, I assent to this. Now, if I really assent to this, what am I going to do? Try to live it out. I'm not going to do it perfectly. I don't mean to say that I have a whole... the complete, like Paul says, I press on in Philippians. I do not have apprehended it. This one thing I do. I forget what is past and press on. I by no means have apprehended, and I reach for the upward prize of the call in Christ Jesus. And so we do. We act. We read something, or we have a knowledge, and then we act on it. So I think, is that sound accurate to when you say what you mean by a leap of faith? Is that...
Okay, let me put it this way. Let me use the term confidence instead of faith.
Okay.
Because faith is probably more theological.
Well, that's what I wanted to... that might bring up some issues for people.
Yeah, so let's say, okay, based on your experience, you're 90% confident that the Christian God is real and the gospel is the accurate message that he's trying to get across. So that 10% is maybe those doubts, maybe those weird things that you don't quite understand, but given that 90%, you can very easily deal with that 10%.
Sure.
Whereas for me, I'm mainly the reverse. There's maybe a 10% affirmation of God in terms of like, okay, I really don't know what started the universe out. I really don't know what started evolution on its path in terms of abiogenesis. Maybe that's God, and maybe that's what I put in that 10%. But it would take but I still have that 90% maybe where I just don't see God on my day-to-day. I don't have any real philosophical reason or logical reasoning that's getting me to think that he might be out there. So that's a huge leap for me.
Okay.
And so in terms of what would get me, what could fill in that 90%, some sort of profound personal experience would certainly fill in that gap nicely.
Yeah.
I would have to, I don't know if it would get me all the way there, but it would at least add to that.
So do you think being convinced would be like a Damascus road for you? Are you looking for something like that? Or do you think the divine convincing is more like a lifelong process?
It could be either one. Like when you put it that way, it makes it me seem like I demand exactly what the Apostle Paul experienced, or nothing less.
I don't mean to say that you are, but sometimes when I hear people say I want a convincing experience, I think of Damascus Road. Obviously, you know, not to say that that's what you want, but you do want, in remaining unconvinced. That seems to be that's what I think Owen had shared with me at one point on the video, at one of the episodes. Just remaining unconvinced was a argument enough that made him question God's existence. And I had coffee with Owen. He's a great guy. I really enjoyed talking to him. But the personal, like, I can remain unconvinced that atheism is untrue, but that doesn't make it untrue, right?
Oh yeah.
So you're of that camp. You at least see the reasonableness that you're being unconvinced is not proof against. It's just you're unconvinced at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fully willing to acknowledge the possibility that there's the stuff that I don't know way surpasses the stuff that I do know.
Yeah, so 80 years from now, you could be like Chris Bielfus, 85 years old, and God comes to you and you're trimming your shrubs out in your garden, and
he just comes down like, "What are you waiting for, dude?
Come on, Chris, I've got to send you somewhere." What? I am slow of speech. I'm 80. Why?
Yeah.
You know.
But kind of like what I was saying, I feel kind of, who am I to ask that of God? But at the same time, for God, that's nothing. He could bonk me on the head while we're talking right now.
Sure.
And if. And this is what I mean when I say, the more detail we have about a God claim, the better we're able to evaluate that. So It's like he said, God loves me. He supposedly cares about me. He knows I'm in trouble right now, according to the gospel, and I need some sort of intervention, or else I'm going to wind up in hell. And supposedly he doesn't want that.
Yeah.
So where is he to pull me out of my this morass of disbelief and skepticism that I'm in? And
well, the gospel story in John 13. I think it's John 13. What Jesus does after the supper. You know what he does? You familiar with that?
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Where he takes the towel and the basin and he starts washing Peter's feet, and Peter at first he's like, no. I mean, Peter's been with him for 3 years, and he doesn't understand the lifestyle of service that Jesus has been teaching them. I mean, what did Jesus do? He healed people. He fed people. He prayed with people. He raised their dead. He healed their sick. And here he is at the supper, about to be sent to the cross, and he is washing Peter's feet, and Peter doesn't get it. Right? Peter says, "No, Lord, why would you wash my feet?" And what Jesus says, "Well, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part with me." And then Peter says, "Well, wash my hands and my head." And so what's going on in Peter's mind right there is that the hands that fashion the universe are washing his feet. And he's like, no. He doesn't understand. And then he says, "Well, wash all of me." And he still doesn't understand. And Jesus says, "No, all I have to do is wash your feet, and you are clean." And then he tells Peter, he said, "If I don't wash your feet, then you have no part with me." And so right there, as the Lord of the heavens is washing his feet, Peter, a disciple who's been with Jesus for 3 years, does not understand what God is doing. And it's the most simplest and humble. You know what foot washing was in the early ancient world, right? It was
probably dusty.
Oh my gosh,
horrible.
you wore the sandals all the time, and your feet were probably well worn, and you come into somebody's house and you wash their feet. It's like the most humbling act of service. And so a lot of times, and then are you familiar with Paul's hymnal to the hymn? I think it's a hymn to Jesus in Philippians 2, where he says Jesus thought it was robbery. Did not consider himself to be. He emptied himself of his divine authority, and he came down to serve. And so I think I just want to maybe encourage you, or to plant a seed to give you a thought that even with Jesus' disciples, when he was touching them, when he was cleaning them, when he was teaching them, they didn't understand what he was doing. Peter's confession in Matthew 16, after Peter confesses Jesus is the Christ, what does he do? He turns around and tries to tell Jesus that I've got to go to Jerusalem and die. And Peter says, "No, Lord forbid it," right? And then what does Jesus say? he's talking to Satan, right? Get thee behind me, Satan. You are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of man. So I think it's interesting that Jesus came, the creator of the universe, if you accept it, came into this world to serve. The hands that fashioned the stars and the hands that fashioned us wash our feet and were put to death. And so in other words, it's easy to miss it.
Yeah, maybe that's what it comes down to.
It's easy
right now. There's something that I just don't get.
Yeah.
And God, if He's real, He knows what it's going to take for me to get it.
Right.
Even if I don't realize what it would take.
Yeah.
And if He does want me to come to a knowledge of Him, then I hope that He would give me what I need to get it finally.
Yeah.
Because if God's real and He wants me to go to heaven, I'd like to go to heaven.
Amen.
It sounds great, but I just don't have.
You need some more traction.
Yeah, I need to know that heaven exists and God is real first before I can really seriously consider what it's going to take for me to get there.
Sure. So this is a multifaceted journey and a process, just as it was for Peter. Right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Even after the resurrection, Peter and Paul still had issues. Peter, when the Jews came, Peter shirked away from the Gentiles, and there were still struggles. So I hope to be a part of your journey for however long, and I hope you continue to seek it out. But thank you for explaining and sharing your story and your thoughts. I've enjoyed it. We have been at this for 90 minutes.
That's a good episode right there.
It is. I think we'll end on that note. So any last thoughts about... I think it's important, too, as we said before we turned the mic on, that we encourage more... being in a group of atheists and Christians at a book club that gathers once a month, what do you feel is the importance for continued dialogue between these two camps? How do you see it?
I feel like there's way too much communication going on the internet these days, and to a certain extent it's good because it does expose you to viewpoints that you might not get otherwise from other countries or around the world and so forth,
right.
But it does lead itself to a certain vitriol, and
it's easy.
And it's also very easy if you don't want that kind of dialogue. It's very easy to find a Christian group where you can vent about atheists and how terrible they are, or find an atheist group to vent about how oppressive Christians are. And one nice thing about our group is that you get to meet people face to face and find out they're not exactly what you would have thought they are otherwise.
Right.
And find out people are really complicated and belief systems are complicated.
Yeah.
And you can't just always reduce people to stereotypes and so forth.
And I think a lot of times when we submit ourselves to the communications technologies of Twitter and Facebook and YouTube threads, that we are, in a sense, dehumanizing ourselves to some degree. I know I told Jim on the part 5 that came out from the Atheist Edge, I said there was some of the comments were so negative. I'm like, it's not even, I don't even have any desire to get even involved in that.
Jim,
he was nice. I mean, Jim, I wasn't angry with Jim. It was just like Jim. I made a few comments on some of the other videos to some more congenial commenters, but for the most part, the tear downs, the sarcasm, it's just not worth getting involved with.
Yeah, Jim, to his credit, he will go through all his YouTube comments.
He does.
And he'll respond to them, and he'll give them consideration. But, which, if he wants to go that route, I'm super proud of him.
Yeah, that's great.
I would rather not deal with people hiding behind anonymity to spew nonsense and invective at people. I'd rather have decent conversations, I think
the Facebook, the Twitter, I think that's fine for a limited sense, but recognizing that we are more than images, but that I think the technology encourages the anonymity, as you just said, encourages our baser natures to come out. It's easier to be critical than it is to be... the very brief time that I tried out Twitter, I had a very small account and very few followers, and I would make I would say, "Hi, so and so, how are you today?" And people didn't know what to do with that. So I think you're right. I think getting in a group, of or not necessarily like-minded people, but just being in the flesh with people, and looking at them, hearing their stories, listening to their voice, hearing where they come from, what they struggle with, what they're processing. It's super important.
Yeah, and I've seen numerous examples of, people, if there are any atheists listening to this, this is a good forum where, if you're worried about, what's going on in this country right now and about theocracy and religious extremists, and if you think Christians are going to make life difficult for non-Christians, get out there and try and talk to some Christians, because if you're worried about extremists, it's hard to be an extremist against someone you know.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've heard about, there's an African-American individual who goes out and seeks out Klan members. And he goes and has conversations with them, and he collects their Klan robes. When these people realize, after they've been talking to a black guy, and he's actually a decent person, because they've been part of this world where, they just don't allow themselves to talk to the very people they're against.
Yeah.
And I think it's very hard to I wouldn't want to have this country go in a way that is anti-Christian, actually anti-Christian, not just what right-wing talk show hosts say is anti-Christian.
Yeah,
but
right.
It's because I know a lot of Christians and I respect a lot of Christians, and I think that having that dialogue is good for balance, so that you don't wind up with extremism in either direction.
Yeah, I think that's what the social media kind of encourages is rift and dissension, because it's extremely easy to be critical of another person's point of view. It's much more difficult to get to know somebody long term. I had a gentleman on one of my, I don't remember where it was. It was a social media no, it was email. It was email through, somebody had contacted me through the podcast via email. No, it wasn't my podcast. It was from one of my appearances on David Smalley's show, Dogma Debate. I gave my email out and got a lot of nice responses from people. I really did. Not all of them. A lot of them were very harsh. But one young man who was about to go into the military said to me, very plainly, he said, "Hey, Dan, I think," we were talking about the Army, and he says, the reason that there are foxholes, the whole theme of are there atheists and foxholes? He said his little quip was, his little corollary was, well, the reason there are foxholes is because of religion in the first place. And I said, no, the reason there are foxholes is because it's much easier to hate your enemy than to love him. Try it sometime. It is much easier to be critical. It is much easier to be demeaning, and it's much easier to be divisive when you're just talking to people on a screen. And even the last discussion that we had over Dr. Ordway's book, you guys have just been doing that series on Jim's page, brought up a very contentious, very difficult, we won't get into it here, maybe for another podcast at some point, discussion about the difference between meaning, or not the difference, but how atheists and Christians determine how to live a meaningful life. It was a pretty saucy but respectful discussion, wasn't it? Was it not? A lot of people got into. I mean, we don't have to get into it here, but that was better discussion in that group, right? Than what if all of us were online and in Facebook? How different that discussion would have unfolded, right?
Yeah, I actually had been having that discussion on Facebook.
Oh, okay.
Something concurrently like that, and like I said, we could do a whole other 90 minutes just on that, and maybe we will.
But I think we would agree at least the best way to sort of hash that out would be to talk to people.
Yeah, I mean, I've been going to this group for over a year now. I found it to be a very worthwhile use of my time.
I mean, I have disagreements with people about meaning and truth, but I'm finding that the best way to resolve those is to meet in person, to talk, to keep the lines of communication open, phone calls, meeting with people at lunch, reaffirming your commitment to a friendship, despite your underlying very real disagreement.
Absolutely.
So we need to keep this going, Chris. Thank you for being our first non-believing guest on Good Heavens, and we hope we certainly hope you don't stay non-believing, but that's out of my control.
Hey, we'll keep talking. See what
We will
happens.
keep talking. We will keep talking. Well, thank you, Chris. Any parting wisdom or words? You want to give a shout out to your blog or to the book club or anything like that?
Yeah, we mentioned it earlier. AtheistChristianBookClub.com is the club that we're a part of. My blog is SleepinginSundays.com. Sometimes I actually update it, but that's...
And then you're on Atheist Edge. What's that? Tell us a little bit about that.
I contribute to Atheist Edge. That is Jim Hall, who's part of our group. He has all kinds of... Sometimes talks about atheist stuff. Other times he has believers on, like you've been on. He's had... James Walker from our book club. He'll talk about a variety of topics, sometimes political, sometimes religious, but
and Jim is as he says, he's grown up atheist. He was never a Christian.
He didn't have that upbringing, so he has a very different perspective.
But I having dealt with Jim, I think it's a great format. Jim is not a vitriolic. He's very much in the belief of the open, honest dialogue. School, which I think is important, and that's one we hope to foster. So check out the atheistandchristianbookclub.com. Is it atheist and Christian or atheist Christian?
It's just Atheist Christian Book
No
Club.
slash,
no slash, no and, no hyphens.
Okay.
It's all one word.
And then your blog is?
My blog is sleepinginsundays.com.
Okay. And then Atheist Edge is?
It's on YouTube. Just search for Atheist Edge.
Okay. Jim Hall and Atheist Edge on YouTube. And of course, we have Good Heavens right here at Good Heavens on Patreon. And so thanks, Chris. It was enjoyable, and maybe this will be the first of a few more. You can be our resident skeptical, keeping us believers in line, making sure we're representing unbelief properly.
Yeah, I'm down. Let's do it again.
All right, Chris. Thank you so much.
Thank you.